Thank you very much, Ambassador. We've got until 14:30, so I'd be very grateful if you introduce yourselves and say which organization you're coming from so that the Senior Civilian Representative can actually know where the question is coming from. And we'll start with GeoTV.
Geo Television Pakistan, Khalid Hamid Farooqi. Ambassador, is there any consideration of demand by the Afghan parliament to bring public trial of the perpetrators who committed crime against 16 Afghan citizens?
Well, that is an issue that's been raised by the Afghan parliament and indeed by a number of Afghan citizens, and I quite understand their anger over the deaths of so many of their countrymen and women in this dreadful incident in Panjwai. But the crimes will be answered for under US law. That is the arrangement which the United States has with Afghanistan in respect of its servicemen, not only here but in other countries as well. I'm sure, though, that the result will be a complete holding to account of anybody responsible for crimes of this sort.
Reuters.
Sebastian Moffat from Reuters. Could you tell us what kind of extra security measures you're going to be taking in to protect NATO troops and to protect other people in Afghanistan as a result of what's happened over the last month or so?
Well, what we have done, of course, is to make sure that we have a strategy for dealing particularly with the possibility of any infiltration that might take place of the Afghan security forces in terms of force protection, but also in terms of issues like cultural awareness of our own forces so that they build the best possible relationship with their Afghan partners. We are also agreeing measures with the Afghan Defense Ministry and the Interior Ministry on issues such as screening of recruits. So there are a number of measures which are being taken. I won't go into a great deal of detail, but this is more, I would say, in respect of the very bad incident we saw of the burning of the Holy Quran, not especially because of the incident in Panjwai.
Just to add to that, Sebastian, you may remember that defense ministers asked NATO to develop a plan at their meeting last month. That plan was approved last night. And the Deputy Commander of ISAF, Lieutenant General Bradshaw, actually briefed all ISAF nations yesterday on those details. The plan concerns reducing the risks of attacks on ISAF by Afghan security force personnel. That plan has been developed by ISAF in close cooperation with their Afghan counterparts, and it's a mix, as the ambassador was saying, of measures concerning vetting, screening, but also training and education. The plan will strengthen ISAF security measures. It will also revise and improve the vetting and the screening and monitoring of Afghan forces. And a point which is really crucial is to improve the cultural awareness on both sides. So there will be improved cultural awareness training both for ISAF and for Afghan security forces in order to bridge that cultural gap, which may sometimes tragically lead to violence and sometimes can lead to animosities. So that plan has now been approved. Europa Press.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ana Pisonero from the Spanish news agency Europa Press. Certain analysts have said that after the killing of the 16 civilians, the level of violence and the level of contestation and questioning the presence of the foreign troops is actually lower than with the incident we had with the Quran. Because you're there on the ground, do you think that this is like this? And is ISAF worried that that the public, especially the Afghans, will continue to increase pressure against ISAF troops until the end of 2014 when we leave? And the second question, if I may, Secretary of Defense Panetta is today there in Afghanistan. I don't know if you already had the opportunity to talk to him, and also if he was able to reject some reports that US would pull out an extra 20,000 troops after this incident. Thank you so much.
Well, on your first point, the burning of the Holy Quran, of course, was taken as an insult to Islam and to all Muslims. We all understand the extraordinarily sacred role which the Quran has within Islam. The murders of the 16 civilians in Panjwai, tragic and sickening as it was, is of a rather different nature. It still, of course, makes people very angry, and I wouldn't presume to speak for Afghan citizens in their reaction to this event. But I think that whereas the burning of the Quran affected all Muslims, the murder of the people in Panjwai does have a rather different character to it. Now, in relation to troop drawdowns, I am certainly not aware of any new proposal for drawing down troops. President Obama announced last year that there would be the removal of 33,000 US troops by October. That is still moving ahead, but there is no new proposal that I am aware of for any troop reduction, and nor do I expect there to be one. As I said earlier, I sense very great solidarity behind the strategy which we have set in ISAF for our campaign in Afghanistan, and I'm sure that we will stick to that task. Now, that does not mean that between now and 2014 there will be no more troop drawdowns. There may very well be. Indeed, it would be extraordinary if we ended up at the end of 2014 with the same level of troops as we might have, let us say, in the middle of 2012. But I don't believe that any decisions have been taken of that sort.
Two questions. First of all, how do you think this latest spate of incidents will affect public opinion in NATO countries? Support for the war has been dropping constantly for the last several years. And what do you think these incidents how will they affect it? And Oana, just one for you. Foreign Minister Lavrov announced today that NATO would be allowed to use an airbase at Ulyanovsk to ferry supplies to Afghanistan. Can you say something about that?
Well, on your question about public opinion in NATO countries, of course, one can read perfectly easily from the opinion polls that people are tired of our engagement in Afghanistan, just as the Afghan people themselves are also tired of years of conflict in their country. But the key point is this, that we have a plan which I believe will deliver by the end of 2014 sufficient stability for the Afghan security forces to control their own future and their own security. Now, I think we understand that if we were to rush that process, if we were to take sudden decisions based on the events of the last few weeks, we would place that outcome in jeopardy, because we need to hand over security when the Afghan security forces are capable of maintaining the security. If we hand over too early, we would risk them facing substantial setbacks which would undermine confidence in this country. And if that were to happen, the consequences for Afghanistan would be very severe, but so too would be the consequences for many of our countries, because it is not only that Afghanistan, if it fell back into chaos, could be a warm environment for international terrorism. That is one element, but it is not the only element. Afghanistan is also the source of narcotics, which would become probably an even greater flow if this country were in a chaotic state. We would certainly see more migration away from Afghanistan, heading towards our countries, and we would also have a source of tremendous instability in what is now probably the most sensitive region in the world. So I think that there are many reasons why we need to explain to our publics and continue to explain to our publics why we need to remain in Afghanistan for a limited further period. I believe that that is an investment which will repay itself in the future.
Slobo, on transit, my understanding is that Ulyanovsk, that is an agreement between Russia and the United States, but I stand corrected, I'll have to look at the details. Clearly we welcome the cooperation we have with Russia already on transit to and from Afghanistan. We look forward to reinforcing that agreement because clearly stability in Afghanistan is in both our interests. NATO and Russia have a joint interest in a stable, secure Afghanistan. And in fact, the very good cooperation we have with Russia on achieving that goal was discussed in the recent phone conversation between the Secretary General and President-elect Vladimir Putin just last week. Frankfurter Allgemeine.
Hi, this is Nicolas Busse for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I was wondering, in your introduction, Ambassador, you talked about the possibility that, or you said you would not want to see the strategy changed and early withdrawal because of the incidents. What if you ask the question the other way around? All the incidents that we've seen over the past couple of days and weeks, don't they help the insurgents? Don't they strengthen the Taliban, give them more support among the population, make it even harder for NATO to achieve the goal to withdraw by 2014?
Well, of course, incidents of this sort don't help our case. That much is true. But equally, it's very clear from polling evidence, if you look at the very substantial poll done, for example, by the Asia Foundation, you will see that the number of people in Afghanistan who have any sympathy at all for the Taliban has been falling year on year. So we shouldn't interpret the understandable anger of Afghan people when they see their countrymen being murdered as in any way consistent with greater support for the Taliban. So I don't think that that is the case. And it's also true that the insurgency has very many problems of its own, and whilst looking at our own difficulties, we should never forget to estimate the picture as it's seen by the leadership of the insurgency. You know, last year they announced their Al-Badr campaign that was going to retake control of parts of Afghanistan that had been lost to Afghan and coalition forces. They said that they were going to disrupt the Loya Jirga through attacks on its security. There have been clear evidence that they wanted to conduct more attacks in big cities like Kabul, but fundamentally they failed. You know, their campaign was not a success. They did not achieve the breakthroughs that they were looking for, and they too face difficulty. It's also the case, of course, that as we begin to talk about the possibilities of investigating negotiations for a political solution, this too causes concern amongst the insurgency. So I don't think that the picture from the other side of the border, from the Taliban leadership in the safe havens, is a particularly rosy picture either.
Second row.
Benjamin Dirks of the Financial Times Deutschland. Ambassador, can you share a few of the things you do to raise cultural awareness? And would it be correct to assume that what's been done so far hasn't been enough? I mean, I'm sure you have to tell people more than not to burn holy books.
Well, look, there is quite a large program of training troops in cultural awareness, and indeed the commander of ISAF instructed that all troops be retrained on issues like the handling of holy materials in Afghanistan to follow up the very sad incident at Bagram in which religious materials were mishandled. The reality is that you need to keep repeating these messages because, of course, our soldiers generally, they want to behave respectfully to their Afghan hosts, but they very often don't come from backgrounds which have had any contact at all with the sort of culture which we have in Afghanistan. So we continue to train our troops in some of the key points of cultural sensitivity, and that, again, as Oana said, is part of the strategy which we have for preventing counterinsurgency and for building strong partnerships with the Afghan security forces. But we have to keep on repeating that message as often as we can, and it's very much on the minds of the military commanders here.
Yeah, I think has a follow-up.
Some of the criticism that I've seen refers to the fact that the problem here that you have is that this war is simply lasting too long, and that the people of Afghanistan are becoming tired of the conflict, as you said, simply because it's taking so long. So some of the critics that I've seen have suggested that this process of transition be speeded up in order to diffuse that specific problem.
Well, of course, speeding up of transition doesn't necessarily stop, unfortunately, the conflict which Afghan citizens have had to live with for so many years. What transition does is it places the security responsibility in the hands of the Afghan security forces. Nobody here is saying that once transition is complete, that of itself will result in peace descending on Afghanistan. I wish it were. If that were the case, then I think that I might agree with you about speeding up transition, but that is not the case. What we are doing is we are putting the Afghan army and the Afghan police in a position, through training, through equipment, through mentoring and advising, in a position where they will be able to prevent the insurgency from posing a threat to the government of Afghanistan. We need to do so at a pace which allows them to grow in confidence. If we push this too fast, we risk them facing reversals because either they are not properly equipped or they don't have sufficient experience of dealing with particular security situations. And any loss of confidence which came from that reversal would be very hard to recover from. So I'm really quite sure, and this is very much reflected in my discussions with the ministers responsible for security in Afghanistan, that we need to follow a pace which is sustainable and which results in the Afghan security forces building up the confidence and competence which they need to face the security threat. For those reasons, I do not think that speeding up the transition process would be of help.
One last question, Agence France-Presse.
Laurent Thomé with Agence France-Presse. The United States is proposing an Afghan army size of around 230,000 troops, which is lower than the target for this year of 350,000. Will that be enough in 2014 for Afghanistan to the government to remain in power against the Taliban?
Well, let me say a number of things about that, because I think this is rather misunderstood in some ways. Firstly, this is not a target for 2014. We have not agreed on the year in which a model Afghan security force of about 230,000 would come into effect. I'm pretty confident that it would not be for some considerable length of time after 2014. That is my first point. My second point is that the figure of 230,000 is a model of what could be achieved within the sort of funding level which we would be asking the international community to support. You know, it's very difficult so far in advance to say exactly what sort of force Afghanistan should have in the years ahead. It's not only the size of the force, but also the equipment level, the balance between police and army. What is being said is that the model on the table, which shows a force of about 228,500, is proof of concept. It shows that a force which would be adequate to protect Afghanistan could be fielded for that sum of money. But it may well be the case as we move forwards that one discovers that actually for that sum of money there are different mixes which would result in more troops than 230,000, or a different balance, as I say, between the police and the army, or a different level of equipment which would raise different possibilities. So in my view, what is being described here is a model of what could be achieved. The decision which ISAF partners and the international community will need to make in consultation with our Afghan partners is whether this is a plausible funding level, and we will then need to raise the commitments that countries will be prepared to support a cost of around 4.1 billion. But that is not a final decision which has yet been taken.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Gass in Kabul, and that's all we have time for now, but we'll try to do that again. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.